Thanks for downloading Speaking of Suicide. I'm Dan Holland, one of the podcast producers from Adventurous Audio. Now this episode is a bit different because it takes the form of a conversation between Shona McPherson and Professor Rory O'Connor. Shona is a counsellor and life coach who works with Mikey's Line and will be a familiar voice to you if you listen to the podcast regularly. Rory is one of the world's leading experts in the field of suicide prevention. He's Professor of Health Psychology, Director of the Suicide Behaviour Research Laboratory and Head of the Mental Health and Wellbeing Group at the University of Glasgow. He's passionate about trying to understand the root causes of suicide in a bid to work out what we can do to reduce the shocking suicide statistics worldwide. His recent book, When It Is Darkest, Why People Die by Suicide and What We Can Do to Prevent It, is a searingly honest search through this challenging and often upsetting subject. It's a book that's written with such compassion and humanity, we couldn't resist asking Rory to take part in Speaking of Suicide. And since it was Shona who first brought Rory's book to our attention and is such a passionate advocate herself of finding ways to stop suicide, we thought it should be Shona who talks with Rory. Speaking of Suicide is meant to be open and honest. That's the whole point. But that doesn't always make it an easy listen. So if you do need to, press pause. Speaking of Suicide is made in collaboration with and in support of Mikey's Line, and I'll give out their contact details at the end of the podcast.
Rory, it's a pleasure to meet you, and because we're here in your office here in Gartnavel, and I've come down from the Highlands where Mikey's Line, who works with the Speaking of Suicide podcast, where Mikey's Line's based, and Mikey's Line was set up in 2015 in response to two young men taking their lives within 48 hours of each other. And I suppose we understand from the research about suicide that Scotland, of the four nations, has been the highest rates of suicide, and then within Scotland itself, there are certain hotspots. I think this year Dundee was the highest, and then next to that, the Highlands and Islands. And so maybe as a starting point, I know we'll go broader, but maybe as a starting point, I could just ask you, if it's okay, why do you think there is such a problem in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland with suicide?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to speak face to face, Shona. It's lovely to have you here in Glasgow, and hopefully, as we hopefully exit COVID-19 and the pandemic, we can have more face-to-face meetings, and that sense of connection many of us have missed. And obviously really thinking about connection and connectivity, so important when we think about suicide. But going back to your question about the sort of different rates of suicide across the UK and across Scotland and the Highlands of Scotland, it's really interesting to think about. So first of all, there's no one single factor associated with suicide, and there's evidence that in rural communities suicide rates are high, but similarly there's evidence that in urban inner city communities suicide rates are high. But although we don't know for certain why the rates were higher, certainly in the Highlands and Islands, obviously it's part to do with potentially isolation, lack of connectivity or connectedness, and maybe there's something also to do with access to services, or the services that people need available when they need them. And I think that goes not just for the Highlands of Scotland, but across Scotland and beyond. We need to think about tailored services for the people who are most vulnerable. And I know I remember speaking to a man once who had attempted suicide from the north of Scotland in the Highlands, and he talked about living in the fish bowl, a goldfish bowl, and he was frightened to reach out for help because people knew him, and he didn't know who he was going to bang into if he went and sought help. So I think there's something about linking that in with shame and sort of issues around masculinity, what it is to be a man, and am I the sort of person who should be talking about my feelings? So I think there's so many complex factors at play. And then also in rural communities, there's greater access to the means of suicide, and that is obviously as part of this puzzle of trying to understand suicide risk. But for me, it's all about trying to remind ourselves that although sadly we hear the statistics periodically on the news, and over 2 suicides per day in Scotland, it's so important that we remember that behind every one of those deaths is a family, is a person, is a tragedy. And so the work that we've been doing over the last 25 years is trying to get some sense of understanding the common factors associated with suicide so we can help and support and protect. But then also just trying to remember how do we think about somebody's unique and lived life, and what can we learn from that to hopefully prevent future suicides.
Yeah, absolutely, I hear you. And what I'm hearing there is no one reason why the Highlands is so high and why other areas are, but there's many things that we can be doing to make a difference in that.
Yeah, but sorry, just on that sort of, I think what's in Scotland we've been doing for many years is trying to understand suicide both at a national level but also at a local level. So for the last time, it must have been 20 years now, Scotland's had the National Suicide Prevention Strategy and Action Plan, and one of the central planks of that is having local responses. So the needs of the population at risk in the Highlands will be very different from the needs of a population of people at risk in Glasgow, in the East End of Glasgow, for example. And I think that understanding that local context is absolutely crucial. So there's no one size fits all. In the same way that there's so many factors associated with suicide risk, it's that not recognising that we need to tailor responses, not just to individuals but to communities.
Yes, absolutely. And do you feel that's happening? Do you feel that these responses are
tailored? Yeah, I think things are. I mean, I think Scotland over the last 10 or 20 years really has led the way in terms of developing national action plans and really trying to galvanise support and galvanise services and political will. Because I think for suicide prevention, I always try and think about suicide prevention at all levels. So first of all, you've got what we all as individuals can do to do our small bit to prevent suicide, but then communities can do their bit. And then obviously at the top level is the sort of societal and political will. And we don't have that political will, we're not going to get anywhere. Now, we're really fortunate that suicide prevention has never been a political issue in Scotland, in the sense that I've lived in Scotland now since 1997, I think it is, and it's never been a political football. Every one of the parties who've been in power have really prioritised suicide prevention. And it's worth noting that although every suicide is a tragedy, that over the last 10 or 20 years, the suicide rates have decreased in Scotland by about 20%. Now, sadly, before the pandemic, we'd started to see this increase in 2018 and 2019. But that was the same as across the UK. Suicide rates had gone up. So we need to try and disentangle why that is. And part of it might be to do with the fact that we've had a change in profile of people now dying by suicide. So the group of people most likely to die by suicide are middle-aged men. But my concern is we've now, and I'm not saying that those statistics aren't concerning. Of course they are. But if we look at underneath the statistics, the most recent increases in 2018 and 2019 and then 2020, slight decrease, which is good news. But there still is this increase amongst young people. Young female suicides have started to increase. So we need to understand, again, this idea of, although I think it is 71% of all suicides in Scotland are by men, and we need to really tackle that group and support that men in particular, but we need to understand these other groups at risk.
Absolutely.
And especially as we leave and recover from the pandemic, although we haven't seen an increase as a result of the pandemic, my concern is moving forward. We've been doing work in which we've been tracking the mental health and well-being of across adults in the UK, and we've also another study funded by government in Scotland. And what we know for certain is, although the suicide rates haven't increased post-pandemic, which is great, but there is evidence of increased distress, and in particular amongst four groups of people. So there's increased suicidal thoughts amongst young people. There's increased suicidal thoughts amongst people with pre-existing mental health problems, people from more socially disadvantaged backgrounds. And then if we look at mental health more generally, there's an increase in poor mental health amongst women. So there's four groups of people we need to really try to target and support and protect. Now, because recovery is going to be bumpy, and we've had all the economic protections of furlough and so on during the pandemic. Now I think we need to be so vigilant moving forward so that increase in mental distress does not translate into increases in suicide.
Right, absolutely. A lot you've said there, Rory, and the thing that I think towards the end maybe we could go back and talk more specifically about young people and some of the other risk groups that you mentioned. But maybe sticking at the macro briefly, maybe to get out of the way, because there's not much we can maybe do in this conversation about it. But from my time working as a support worker, we would work with some people who had complicated mental health needs, and were often highly suicidal, moving from crisis to crisis. And no disrespect to anybody working in mental health service provision, people all doing an amazing job with what they can. But the waiting lists were awful, and the individual support that was collaborative, as you talk about in your book, to that person being involved in their care, it just wasn't there. And it was incredibly difficult to work with somebody, and just to what we were doing was sort of, crisis management, and again I hope we can talk about safety planning and things like that. But what can we do about this?
Well, this is a perennial problem, and I mean in every country that I'm aware of in terms of mental health services, there's not enough has been done. And although there has been this push for parity of esteem for mental health provision and physical health provision, you're right, the waiting lists are unacceptably high, and in particular for children and young people, for some of the waiting lists for child and adolescent mental health. But that's not just Scotland, that's the UK, that's America, it's slightly different in America, different model of care, obviously, but lots of countries. So I don't think we've cracked how we best do that, because I think what we need to do is try to deliver as much support in the moment, right? But then that in that crisis, there's something to do with crisis support, and then there's something to do with longer term dealing with complex mental health needs, as you touched on there. Now, in Scotland, we are doing what's known as a distress brief intervention based work, and we're involved in that. And first in the world, if anything like it, and totally novel in that there's no waiting list. And so the distress brief intervention started off as this pilot in 4 areas in Scotland, and obviously what it means is that anybody in distress, not somebody who's acutely suicidal, but somebody in distress, can be referred into getting up to 14 days of support. But there's no waiting list. The minute you do make the referral, within 24 hours, the person is contacted and offered the support. Now, the point of that is trying to support people in those moments of crisis, because we do know that crises tend to be really bunched together in time. They can come back again, of course, but what you're trying to do is support people in those moments, those crucial moments. And I think we need to think of new models of care and support. And I think the DBI, the Distress Brief Intervention Programme, that's one such approach. But I think what we need to think about is, well, how do we then deal with people with much more complex mental health needs? Because DBI was not designed for people with severe and enduring mental health problems. That's not the purpose of it, because those pathways do exist. But what we need to do is, well, actually ask ourselves, are they tailored to the needs of the population who really, really need them? And I'll say one more thing about treatment and support, and this is an international problem we have, is that although in my book I talk about the evidence base for the treatment of people who are suicidal, and the evidence base is growing for psychological treatments, psychological therapies like cognitive behavioural therapy or dialectical behavioural therapy, or whatever the therapy is, but we don't know whether they work for men. And you think that for a second, right? 3/4 in the UK, 3/4 of all suicides, 71% in Scotland, are men, and we don't know whether these treatments work for men. And the reason that is because most of the studies, there's not enough men are recruited into the studies, or the studies aren't large enough for you to look at sort of dissect the results to see, do those results work, or does that treatment work for a man versus a woman? Or never mind other genders and other sexual identities. There's a whole loads of stuff going on there. So as a field, as somebody who works in the suicide prevention research field, that is a big challenge we have. So we need to understand that better, and then translate that into treatment on the ground. And treatment in Highlands or in Glasgow, no matter where it is, it shouldn't be a postcode lottery. It should be the access to these services. Everybody should have the same access.
Absolutely. And when you mentioned the DBI service, I think Inverness is one of the pilot areas where they were certainly on the ground. And the thing that you've said really resonated, that it wasn't designed for people, it was for people in crisis, not highly suicidal, with complex mental illness. And so, we referred folks into it, and I think it was a good service, but it probably wasn't appropriate. And as you say, then the need for these tailored interventions. And I suppose, it's probably a difficult one for you. Where are these going to come? Because it's the funding. Where is the?
Yeah, I mean, part of me sometimes thinks that. Well, so when you think about mental health problems or mental illness, whatever term you use, it's usually also embedded in social disadvantage. If you look at the statistics, it's an issue of social inequality. So I think we need to tackle that social inequality, because often one of the drivers of that social inequality leading to poor mental health is early life adversity, so childhood adverse experiences. And again, we've done a lot of work now looking at the association between, obviously, adverse childhood experiences, mental health, and suicide risk. And it's the relationship is just stark as a very stark thing, right? It's so clear. So we need to do more, and that early intervention work is absolutely crucial. So thinking about, so we know that, somebody who experiences early life trauma is at increased risk of poor mental health, but it's not inevitable. And what we need to do is better understand how can we protect, what are the resilience factors, what else can we do to ensure that those young people who've grown up starting out in adversity flourish. And I think in Scotland we are trying to do that, but I think there is no easy fix. And there's the Children and Young People Programme Delivery Board, I think it's called now, or Implementation Board at government level, and it's trying to do all those things. And part of that is Scotland is one of the first countries in the world to do properly trauma-informed training for the whole workforce at the front line. So that, because part of it is helping us understand, and when I say us, I mean any one of us in the community, to understand what might be the impact of somebody who's experienced trauma. And part of that impact is that somebody who experienced trauma may not have any trust in services, may not have trust in adults in general. And that maybe, then the impact then is they're less likely to seek help, because everybody's always let them down. Nobody treats me well. I'm not treated with common humanity or respect. So why should I reach out for help? Because when I reach out for help, it's just failure and being treated badly. That's sadly the reality for too many people. So I think part of the understanding is us then all trying to think about what it feels like for somebody to experience trauma, and then how can we then advocate and make sure that changes happen to services and supports. But then, crucially, we have to make the services available, and that takes investment. And there has been improvement in investment, but we always can do better.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be quite overwhelming, actually. As you're saying all of that, I'm beginning to feel a little bit overwhelmed at the scale of what we need to understand and work.
Yeah, but absolutely, totally. It is overwhelming, but I always try and remember that each one of us can make a difference. And each one of us, by just treating the person next to us with respect and reaching out in that way, I think we can, one by one, we all build up, and then we build a movement. And it's overwhelming, but one of the other things that we're doing in Scotland is, again, we're currently reviewing the next phase of the Suicide Prevention Strategy and Action Plan, hopefully planning for the next 10 years. But one of the things we've done thus far is basically we set up this new social movement, the United to Prevent Suicide. And what we're trying to do is grow a social movement to get people have a sense of we all can do something to prevent suicide. That's not about advocating responsibility. That's trying to us empower ourselves and our neighbours, and then we all can be a voice to government and saying we need to do more.
Absolutely. In your book, you talk about what's happening to somebody when they become suicidal, and you spoke really articulately in your book about this sense of entrapment and like suicide being a cry of pain rather than a cry of help. Somebody being sort of locked into their inner world where they feel like there is no hope, that they're stuck, and the only way out is to end their life, not because, again, last thing to quote you can get about, not that they want to die, but they don't want to live anymore. So yeah, it'd be wonderful just to hear more in your own words, Rory, about understanding that.
So it's that idea that, to my mind, suicide is more about wanting the pain to end, the mental pain to end, rather than wanting to end your life. It's just like you can't see any other way to end that pain, and you're just utterly exhausted. And that sense of being trapped or by mental pain or by life circumstances. And so for me, one of the questions I continually ask myself, and I ask others to think about, is when somebody is, or when we're trying to prevent suicide, we're trying to see what are the drivers to contribute or make people feel more trapped, right? So that sense of being trapped can again work at all different levels. So on an individual level, often that's triggered by a series of maybe interpersonal crises, like relationship issues or trauma, as we mentioned already. And you can see how that can contribute to feelings of defeat and humiliation and rejection. And these, so in terms of the sort of precursors to that trapped mental pain, it's like, I feel worthless and I'm just caught in that situation. Now, so that's at an individual level. But then if you bring it right up, if you're somebody who presents to clinical services with mental health problems and you're not treated with respect, or you go and try and get support for not being able to find a job or whatever it may be, or at school you're treated as if you're not worth anything. Of course, all those things are doing is contributing to a sense of entrapment, because it makes you. People often talk about being felt. They're made to feel even more worthless, more that they're a burden. And one of the key drivers we know from, in terms of understanding the suicidal mind, is that sense of being people who die by suicide often talk about being a burden on others. And so the question I'm always asking is, what are the contributors to that sense of entrapment that somebody then becomes so overwhelmed that they then see suicide as the only option? So that could be that somebody who's experienced awful trauma early in life has never had the support and to really manage that pain or make sense of that pain that they're going through. And then you can see if that happens often enough through life, well, we're all finite in the amount of pain we can experience. In the same way, there's only a limit to the amount of physical pain we can tolerate. It's the same with mental pain. And if you're somebody then who's gone through repeatedly experiences of trauma, you can sort of see them, how they just become exhausted, utterly overwhelmed with life, and life that's the only option for them. Where somebody else is basically, every journey is different, every story is different. So it's not necessarily. So when we do a lot of work which look at checklist approaches of risk factors, and I think some senses that's okay because it gives you some sense of who might be vulnerable, people who are unemployed or people being bereaved or whoever it may be. But for me, it's always trying to understand how all those experiences impact on you as an individual, and then how it changes your view of your past, or impacts on your view of your past, your present, and crucially, your future.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you're describing this sense of entrapment, and often coming from a background of trauma, it's sounding like for many, and I know you're not saying this for everybody, but it's a build-up over time, it's a long chronic process. And I'm curious, sometimes we hear of these deaths and it's the family, it's come from nowhere, and maybe they're not obvious risk factors there, or those things. Do you think it's the same feeling, but it just comes so unknown and it just comes out of the blue that it just flattens people?
Yeah, so I think that's such an important point, because there's different pathways to suicidal thoughts and then behaviours. And yet for some, as I've described, as this chronic over time, for long, and often that's associated with social inequality and disadvantage over a very long period of time. Again, there's lots of examples, sadly, the family just did not see it coming at all. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is, so we've been doing a lot of work on what's known as social perfectionism. And social perfectionism is this sort of personality characteristic in which that you think that other people in your life have these really high expectations for you and your behaviour and whatever your achievements, whatever they are, but these aren't real expectations. It's what you think they expect of you. And so for people who are really high in social perfectionism, and I'm one of them, is every day is an opportunity to fail others and to feel you're letting other people down, and then you're more likely to feel defeated and humiliated, or a sense of shame or rejection or whatever it is. Now that's often hidden, and so the number of families and people I've known who basically, from the external person looking in, and you couldn't understand why on earth they would feel suicidal, but they were experiencing mental pain for periods of time which was hidden, and that sort of mask. And one of the things I think I say in the book is there's no one face of somebody, there's no one type of person who is suicidal. It could be any one of us, and that's important for a number of reasons. One is it helps us to be vigilant, but two, it helps us challenge the stigma around what it is like to have somebody who's struggling with their mental health, because it genuinely can be any one of us. So it's not. So the point about bringing up the social perfectionism is that in the book I think I describe it as having psychological thin skin. So that if you then think of two, say, young people, both, for example, God forbid, experiencing bullying, and if so, one young person who's been bullied but isn't very socially perfectionistic, they're unlikely, the impact on their mental health of the bullying is probably less than somebody who has high in social perfectionism, and that idea that you're piercing your social perfectionism is this psychological thin skin, and then when the arrows of adversity are thrown at you, or whatever bowed, whatever the verb is for happens with arrows, but it's much more likely to impact on your mental health. And so I think when we're thinking about trying to understand suicide risk for that person I just described, and we've done some work with adolescents just on this particular issue, looking at self-harm more generally, and exactly we find that as young people who are more likely to self-harm, we're not necessarily the ones who'd experienced the most stress in their lives, but even those who experience moderate levels of stress, if they also are high in social perfectionism, they're much more likely to self-harm. And that sense of rejection, right, which or pain in adolescence is often really, really hard for us as adults to understand, because we know from all the sort of brain imaging research now is that, for example, in adolescence, there's this period, this critical window in which adolescents are so sensitive to what we describe as social signals in the environment, and especially if they're negative, like bullying, like anything else, which is like basically seems like an attack on you in terms of rejection. So I think for me, it's trying to understand, the question is always, does that person feel trapped? And the causes of that entrapment could be short-term or long-term. And when we think about prevention, that's when we need to think about those different profiles.
Yes, absolutely. I've read quite a bit about the risk factors for suicide, but reading your book and thinking about entrapment, those risk factors made much more sense. But I wonder if you could explain what the risk factors are with that lens of entrapment.
Yeah, I think the way we assess entrapment is probably a good place to begin, and we use the scale which was developed by a psychologist, Paul Gilbert, quite a few years ago. But it asks simple questions like, to what extent do you feel trapped inside yourself, right? And that's one way of trying to understand that mental pain. But the signals or signs of suicide, or somebody is suicidal, there are a number of them, but they're easy. It's really important to highlight. They're easier to detect after an event, sadly. And I suppose what I'm trying to do with the book is help people become more aware. And so there are things like obviously changes in behaviour. So in addition to that entrapment or being hopeless, but things about talking about being a burden on others, changes in their behaviour in terms of their eating, their sleeping, sexual behaviour, alcohol, drugs. And alcohol, drugs and sleeping are particularly important, I think, because the three of those we would describe as they impact on your homeostatic function. So if you don't sleep well, that makes your body's capacity to problem solve, to regulate your emotions much more difficult. And the same with drugs and alcohol, and especially if you think about alcohol being a depressant. And then if you think more broadly then of the sort of people who are experiencing chronic stress, one of the things I talk about in the book is the work we've been doing on cortisol, on the sort of stress system. And again, so when we encounter threatening situations, our body releases cortisol, and that's sort of to prepare us to fight or flee, but also cortisol we also think is associated with problem solving, again emotion regulation, and decision making. So if you think of somebody the example of somebody who's experienced trauma early in life, so that repeatedly being basically metaphorically being beaten, right, in that context, the body's continually having to respond. And so what we think happens in people who are suicidal is the stress system breaks down, doesn't work as well, you're releasing less cortisol, and then so it means that physiologically your body's not preparing you as well as it could to fight or flee. And if you add to that the sense of mental pain, this entrapment, you can start to see how this perfect storm of factors comes together. And then add to that, we've also shown that the trauma people tell us they experience as kids, that predicts how much cortisol people will release in our lab when we do some of our experiments. So what I'm just trying to illustrate is that when we think about suicide, we have to take this sort of lifespan perspective, but also acknowledging the complexity, and then in terms of then warning signs, that sense of being trapped, burden, hopeless, changes in behaviour. Some people also may have tried to get their life affairs in order. So things like that there's something that you just can't quite put your finger on. And then the other one I would say, which is an important one, which again I talk about in the book, is that for people who say somebody is in the midst of a depressive episode, and then for no apparent reason, their mood seems to lift, and it seems as if they're okay again. Our concern there is there's warning, that's a sort of alarm bells, because what we think may happen is when someone's in the depths of a depressive episode, you actually don't have the motivation or capacity to plan a suicidal act. But maybe then what happens sadly for some people is in the midst of that depressive episode, they decide, actually, I've got the solution to my problems. I'll end my life. And then as the mood lifts, you then get more of the cognitive wherefore and the motivation to plan the act. So my message in terms of warning sign is, if there's an unexplained improvement in mood, check in with the person to see that they are okay. Because of course, if the person is getting treatment or support or the crisis has resolved, of course that's understandable why the mood has increased. It's that unexplained change. That would be another one I would look at.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, that's really helpful. And then I suppose going from there, you've mentioned there asking someone if they are okay. On a professional level, as a counsellor, I'm quite regularly would ask somebody if they're feeling suicidal or if they've had suicidal thoughts. But recently in my personal life, over the last few months, I've been in conversations with friends and they've said something like, they told me a life situation, and I've just had enough. And I was just like, oh yeah, you've had enough. And I almost just ignored that. Mm-hmm. And then I was like, oh, hang on, you're avoiding this, Shona. They are actually, I think, trying to say something else. And I've noticed kind of my heart rate going up, and then that kind of, okay, get on with this, say this. And then asking them, and then this sort of, from in both incidences, the person then decided they did want to say a little bit more. Not one case, not a lot, quite a bit. But I just for myself, doing this as a job, and then still it's so hard in my personal life. All of that is supposed to say, how can anybody listening to this ask someone if they're suicidal? How's the best way to do that? And how can they get beyond their own nerves and awkwardness about that? Or even fear of saying the wrong thing, or the myth of that they might even be putting someone more at risk.
Yeah, well, just to tackle that last bit, which by putting somebody more at risk is, so there's no evidence at all that asking somebody whether they're suicidal plants the idea in their head. But the evidence does show that asking somebody directly, are they suicidal, can get them the help and support they require. So it's really important that we continue to challenge that myth, right? So it's definitely a myth. And going back to the question about asking about suicide, of course it's difficult. I mean, and I've asked that question countless times now, and it does get easier, but it's still really, really difficult. And I actually talk about a person I met in the book who basically had seen a documentary that I was involved in, and the documentary gave him the courage to ask the question of one of his friends, and his friend was suicidal and got the help and support he needed. And again, I've come across that many, many times now. And I talk, but the example that guy in the book was basically he didn't know how to answer the question. He was petrified asking the question, and he fumbled and said all the wrong words. But he said enough that it opened up the conversation, and his friend just started crying because nobody had ever asked him about how he was feeling. And then the next day, his friend spoke to his GP, I think it was, and then got support. And then, but what they had an agreement, which was, if he ever feels like that again, please contact him again. And he did. And so that's, for me, that story, the guy got in touch with me to tell me that story, and I thought it was so important because it demonstrates a number of things. One is, you don't have to have the right words. If you do it, if you say it with basically a sense of humanity, that you care and compassion, that's the most important bit for me. That's the first thing, most important. In terms of asking the question, though, one of the things I think is so important is, if we think about any interaction we ever have with anybody, right? So if I'm asking you a question and I want that answer to be no, I'll ask that question in a particular way, and you'll implicitly pick up on that and you'll say no. It's the same if you're asking the question to your friend or colleague, whoever it may be, are you suicidal? If you do it in such a way that you really want that to be no, because of course you're scared if that answer is going to be yes. But if you think that, the person will probably pick up on it and they'll probably just not disclose. So my message would, please, I know it's difficult, but try and be as open to a question being that the answer is yes, and don't mealy mouth it around. Just ask directly. Are you thinking of ending your life? Have you thought about taking your own life? Be direct, and then that response, try not to minimize. Try not to basically say things like, "Oh, but your life, it'll be fine. Your life's all this, that, and the other." Right? It's just the person often needs heard, and especially if they've never said it before. It's a big thing to disclose, and there's often shame associated with feeling suicidal. So it's trying just to be there in the moment with the person, be non-judgmental, and then it's about trying this. One of the things I say repeatedly in the book is it's all about collaboration, right? Collaboration and compassion and connection, the 3 C's effectively. But that sense of then trying to work out together, okay, what will we do next? If your friend discloses that they're suicidal, then that could be, right, let's agree to speak to your GP or to somebody else you know or another mental health professional, whatever it is. And then it's about trying to make sure the person's safe and just ask them, do you think you can keep yourself safe between the disclosure of the suicidal thoughts and maybe going to see your GP? Or always so, if the person themselves doesn't think that they can keep themselves safe, then I would just always go for emergency services as your ultimate response. Yes. And then I think so the last thing is that because people tell me they're always, when you meet me at a party, these are the stories that people always tell me, and the reality is I genuinely don't think I've ever come across anybody who's asked a question and the person's been offended or you've hurt or harmed. So in all my years working in the area, all I know is that the stories, or maybe I'm only been told those stories, but I just don't think so. Usually asking a question will give you a response, and even if the person doesn't admit it the first time, it's opened up that conversation potentially for the future. And I've definitely come across lots of people over the years who they asked once on one occasion and the person said, no, not at all. But then later they talked about it at a later date. Yeah. So it's opening that having the door open a bit, even if the door is just ajar and the person doesn't walk through it in the sense of talking about their suicidal thoughts initially, they may do in the future.
Yeah. As you were saying that, I was just thinking as well, like if someone isn't suicidal and you ask the question, and even if they're never suicidal in the future, in the act of asking them the question, we're just making it more acceptable to talk about suicide. Yeah. And even then they might be worried about somebody else and say, oh yeah, my mate asked me the other day, I didn't mind, I thought it was lovely that they cared that much, and kudos to them, they were brave. So it's just really important, isn't it? And I think most people, if we are genuine, we're sincere and thoughtful, even if we're stumbling over our words and thinking we're saying the worst thing, people see that, they feel totally. Your authenticity, your care.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's a bit just being authentic and genuine and whatever, and true to yourself. And the other bit which is worth saying, I did a documentary a couple of years ago with, it was last year with Roman Kemp, the DJ, and part of it he did was he met this group of kids, or not kids, young men in, I think, somewhere in Kent or wherever it was, I can't remember. But their big thing was, amongst their group of friends, was always ask twice. Mm-hmm. So it's not, so when you ask that question, are you doing okay? If you're just asking a general mental health question, usually if you ask that question once, people's automatic response is, yeah, I'm fine. But then there's, are you really okay? And I think that's a useful piece of advice. And I think certainly that's what I would always do, is always ask more than once.
Because we've almost got this sort of cultural thing of, how are you doing? It's like saying hi, isn't it?
Yeah.
So then fine, how are you doing? Yeah. Oh, how are you doing? Oh, right. He actually wants to know.
Yeah. Well, it comes back to that point I made earlier about the if you ask the question in such a way which you sort of want the answer to be one way, you'll get that response. Mm-hmm. Whereas exactly as asking it the second time means, they really do want to know what I want or how I'm feeling.
Absolutely. Lots of thoughts are sparking now, and I'll try and quickly order them. Maybe briefly, you mentioned asking someone if they have suicidal thoughts rather than if they're suicidal, which I know that we can ask both and all that. Mm-hmm. But just sticking with suicidal thoughts themselves, how common are they, Rory? How common is it for someone if someone's having suicidal thoughts right now, they might think, oh my gosh, this is awful, and even judge themselves about that and make their mental health even worse. So it might be useful just to think about that.
Yeah, so it depends on which, there's lots of studies that have looked at this, and it depends which age group you're looking at. So if you look at adults, we've done studies. We'll start with young adults. We've done a study in Scotland, nationally representative of adults aged 18 to 34 in Scotland. I think when we were trying to look at suicide attempts, suicidal thoughts. And off the top of my head, I think it was 16% of 20% I think it was 20% of the adults reported having suicidal thoughts, right? At some stage in their lives, right? So, and then if you look at across the whole adult population from 18 to 80, the prevalence rate is probably about 5 or 6%. But obviously, young adults are much more likely to report suicidal thoughts or suicidal behaviour, and also, if you think more broadly about sort of lifespan perspectives, is it mental health problems in general, or suicidal thoughts, or suicide attempts, or any form of self-harm is really rare before puberty. Then puberty kicks in, and you start to see then the rise in mental health problems and the rise in self-harm and suicidal behaviour, and actually, during adolescence, that is the steepest curve, or steepest rise in increase in risk at any stage in the whole of the life. So that crucial bit of adolescence is so important. And also remember that most mental health problems will have manifest before your early 20s. So that's why it comes back to this message. I think I said it early on in this podcast, is early intervention is absolutely crucial. Dealing with people's early life trauma, doing as much as possible, because never mind the fact that personally people will benefit, and socially people will benefit of course, but even economically it makes sense. So I mean, and it's awful talking about people's mental health or people's lives in terms of money, but the return from investing in early life will be paid back absolutely manyfold by people's been having their mental health protected as they go through life. And that's why we need to do so much more in early life.
Absolutely. I'm just checking I've understood that one about the two studies that you did there. Were you saying that it was more that people who were older wouldn't report or admit that they'd had the suicidal thoughts? Is that why the statistics were lower?
Well, it's just, basically. And then if you think, let's get into technical in terms of the design of these studies, is because if I have a study across the lifespan, yet older people will tend to report less suicidal thoughts, right, compared to younger people. So if I then focus, if I just do a study of younger people, then I'm getting this. Most of them or more of them are going to report suicidal thoughts, whereas when I do the whole adult population, it hides the different rates of suicidal thoughts across the different life periods, and but for me, I think the message is that suicidal thoughts are probably more common than people think, and never ever dismiss suicidal thoughts or never dismiss self-harm. It's always trying to understand, well, what is causing that, what's going on, and then obviously what can we do to help.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other part, I'm not sure I'm understanding, so I'll just check as well. When you were saying that the highest risk is going through adolescence.
Rate of risk. So
rate of risk.
So if you look at people can't see in the podcast, I'm doing a thing with my hand which looks like a slope. But yeah, so if you think that any form of self-harm or suicidal behaviour is very rare before puberty, but then from that period, say, and it's obviously different for girls and boys, so the onset of self-harm and suicidal thoughts comes earlier in girls than boys, but basically that rate of increase in that period then from puberty through to your mid-20s, that's the steepest rate of increase in onset of or experience of suicidal thoughts and suicide attempts. Then it levels off and then decreases. So for example, if we look at self-harm, and there's very few sort of longitudinal studies on this, but there's a famous study from New Zealand which shows that by the age of 16, 1 in 5 girls will have self-harmed, right? So age of 16, 1 in 5 girls 20% will have self-harmed. And basically, but most of them 95% will have stopped self-harming by their mid-20s. So what it illustrates, that critical window of early life is so important.
And that's how recent have we had recorded information about young people and particularly women self-harming?
Well, there was a famous, in adolescence, there's a famous study called the Child and Adolescent Self-Harm in Europe study in the 1990s, which first showed this. But we conducted work here in Scotland. We did a similar, the same survey in Scotland, and we published that in 2009. So we've been known that rate is definitely that 1 in 5 for girls. So it's about, in general, if you look at all sex genders, it's about minimum 10%. And then obviously, then different groups, so LGBTIQ plus rates of self-harm and suicidal behaviour, markedly higher. Then you add into that people from socially disadvantaged backgrounds, higher. So there's lots of then more subgroup analysis you can do, but we've been knowing that for some time, that gender difference.
Just maybe to summarise what I'm understanding so far, because I'm keeping track, that you were talking about entrapment and what might be going on for an individual there, and then as friends or relatives, the signs to look out for if someone's experiencing this entrapment, and then how we could ask them. And then you talked briefly about keeping people safe. When I worked as a support worker with Mikey's, I remember being quite cynical about safety plans. Service users might have them from other organisations or from ourselves, and it felt quite kind of ticky boxy. Okay, who could you speak to if things are feeling really bad, or have you thought about having a bath and putting on a candle? I'm not in any way saying that these aren't useful interventions to do, but reading your book, the thing that changed my attitude towards safety plans was getting somebody involved, really listening to them, and when they're hopefully feeling well enough to do that, and collaborating and having the safety plan together. Is there anything else that feels important to say about safety planning?
When I first came across safety plans, I mean, I was needed some convincing, because they are relatively straightforward and simple interventions. And so just for those of you who don't know what a safety plan is, so a safety plan is this 6 steps of brief intervention in which you ask somebody to think about the warning signs that a crisis is escalating, and then steps 2 and 3 really are looking at people you can contact or places you can go to distract you when that crisis may be escalating. And then you've got obviously professional contacts is the next step, and then the last step in step 6 is keeping the environment safe, so you can hopefully at that moment of crisis not act on your thoughts, because one of the big things we know is that suicidal thoughts wax and wane, they come and go in waves. And what I think with a safety plan is really helpful is trying to keep somebody safe when those suicidal thoughts and urges are really, really high. And so a safety plan, I think, is really, really important in that regard. But crucially though, and I think you've highlighted it already, is that it's a collaboration, right? So safety plans are used widely, but I would argue that they're often used in a way which isn't optimal. So for example, you shouldn't send somebody away with a safety plan and ask them to complete it on their own. Part of the completion of the safety plan is that sense of compassion, that relationship building with somebody, but also when you're getting them to complete with you the safety plan, it's at each step you're sense checking it, you're working out what's the pros and cons of each step. Would actually, especially in the sort of what you do if a crisis is escalating. So, and are they including things in the step which are pragmatic, practical, and they'll actually use. And so then you're helping the person problem solve. So I think to my mind, that bit of it's working collaboratively to problem solve and having somebody think through in advance of. So the reason we think it's effective is somebody then has thought through what they'll do the next time a crisis escalates, and that planning helps the person keep themselves safe. And we've just done a feasibility study of doing safety planning and telephone support in Scotland, and again we've written up some of the findings of that. And what we found is one of the key findings is that this is with people who'd attempted suicide. We completed a safety plan with them in hospital, and then we offered them up 4 or 5 telephone calls over the next 4 or 5 weeks when we know people are really vulnerable. And in that 4 or 5 week period from our study, 79% of the people who completed the safety plan in hospital used it at least once in the next 45 weeks. And they found it helpful, and we did qualitative interviews to see what people thought of it. So I think it is really important, but it's a collaboration. It's about, again, collaboration, connection and compassion. Those things have to be at the heart of a safety plan. It's not just that one-page document. It's that relationship building and co-problem solving.
Yeah, co-problem solving. I like that. Thank you. The Speaking of Suicide podcast, we're often interviewing people who have been bereaved by suicide themselves. And a very common question, which I think we've looked at already today to some extent, is the why. But the other thing that people often talk about is the what ifs. What if I had done this differently? What if I had done that differently? And living with this really acute grief. And I suppose, so I wonder what do you want folks to hear? What message to give them in that context? And I'm a big believer in asking good questions as well. And I wonder, are there kinder questions? I think people have to go through their questions. You can't say don't ask that question, but sometimes maybe we can also point to them once you're tired of that question or feel you're not getting any answers. Might be a better.
Yeah, it's such an important one, and as somebody who's been twice bereaved myself, as well as meeting so many amazing people I've had the honour of sharing their stories of their own grief. I think it's recognising it. For me, it's about, there are those what ifs, and those what ifs will always be there. And I talk a lot about the what ifs in the book, but I think it's part of it is accepting that we'll never know the answer to some of those what ifs. We'll never know what was in the mind of our loved one in those minutes before they died, and part of that's acceptance. Part of it is overcoming the guilt, the shame, the anger, and that all changes. I think that changes over time, and it's different, experienced differently for everyone. Recognizing that everybody's grief is unique and is different, and that certainly in my experience, and the research evidence will tell us that things do get better, they change. Now, life will never be the same again. I think that's just the reality. But the way in which we can manage or cope with that or respond to that changes, and so I think that there is hope. And what I've tried to do in the book actually is talk about some of the hope, and the hope that that maybe we can do something which will prevent others experiencing the loss that we've experienced and the pain that we've experienced, but also just making sense of that. For some people, one of the conclusions is, well, actually our loved one is now at peace, and there's that sense of, well, thankfully they're no longer suffering. But for me, it's about two messages. Is just us, all of us, just recognizing that our grief is different. Everybody's grief is different. There's something definitely unique about the grief associated with suicide and other causes of death, and everybody goes through that differently. But and that no 2 days will be the same, and there could be days and periods in which things seem absolutely fine, and then the next year something that's just triggered an utter flood of tears and despair, and I think it's just having somebody that you can reach out to in those moments and support. And again, I talk about try and provide some guidance for those who are maybe trying to support somebody who's bereaved, and part of it is just being there for the person on their terms, and then whatever that person wants and needs. But again, recognizing you rarely will say the wrong thing. Again, if you're guided with this sense of common humanity, compassion, and sort of authenticity, and sort of that's the guiding principle, I think, for just responding to somebody, because the stigma still remains, and so many people still talk about the stigma of people crossing the road not to speak to them, but that's often out of fear and ignorance, and it's not. I mean, ignorance in the true sense of that word, in that they just don't know. They don't know what to say, and they're frightened. They're terrified of saying the wrong thing. Yeah. And I think so. It's just again trying to normalise these conversations. And actually, one of the great new developments in Scotland has been where the National Suicide Prevention Leadership Group is piloting in 2 areas in Scotland thus far a bereavement service. So hopefully then that will be, when that's evaluated, hopefully then that will be then basically rolled out across the country, because the reality is, at this moment in time, if you're bereaved by suicide, the response you get is patchy, but what we need to do is build on the best evidence to get people the support that they need. But when they need it, so that could be today or tomorrow, or the day after their bereavement, or it could be 3 months later or a year later. It's just having no supports in place, and that's something we are doing, because when I say we, I mean at the national level, government level, trying to do that, to do as much as we can to basically help people through their grief. But also we recognise that people bereaved by suicide are also at risk of suicide, and it's trying to do whatever we can to protect them and ensure their voices are heard, and that hopefully it can assuage some of the pain they're going through.
Yeah. Rory, you've been working in this area, is it 25 years? Is that right?
Yep.
What keeps you going? What gives you hope and enables you to do this work?
That's a good question. I don't know. As somebody who, when I first got involved in the field of suicide, I wasn't directly affected, and then obviously, as I talk about in the book, I've been twice bereaved to important people in my life. So, what that has illustrated to me is the pain of bereavement by suicide, but how difficult it is to predict suicide, and I suppose if I can help with the work that we do, and it's not just me, it's a team of people I lead, and working with people internationally and with people with lived experience, if I can do something to help somebody else understand their own pain, or the pain, or understand why their loved one may have died by suicide, or do something that we can stop even one more person dying by suicide, that's what keeps me up, it keeps me going, and that's why I do it every single day, to try and make one difference, because a difference in one person, that's enough for me. And I think that we all can make a difference. I suppose my last thing to say is, even though we were talking earlier about the overwhelming nature of suicide prevention, it's so complicated, yet so complicated, but small things can make a difference. And like that sense of reaching out to somebody, a neighbour or a friend, smiling rather than growling at somebody, talking nicely and treating people with respect, those small things, we all do things like that. We're building a better world, a world which is more compassionate, a world which is more supportive, a world hopefully where suicide is less common.
A world where our pain can be held by another, they can smile at us and just, Thank
absolutely.
you, I love that. Like distilling that simplicity of kindness, and so thank you so much.
Not at
for
all.
your
No,
time.
thank you so much for coming through.
Yeah.
Shona McPherson was talking to Professor Rory O'Connor, and a reminder, Rory's book, When It Is Darkest, is published by Vermilion. A reminder of Mikey's line: if you or somebody you know needs help or advice, you can text 077 86 20 7755. That's 077 86 20 7755. Or contact them via Messenger, web chat or Twitter. Sunday to Thursday, 6 p.m. to 10 p.m, Friday to Saturday, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Speaking of Suicide is made possible thanks to Mikey's Line and the ongoing support of D&D Paving Limited. Please do like, share and comment about the podcast. It really helps us get it out there to people who might find it helpful. And if you want to get involved by sponsoring an episode or telling your story, get in touch with Mikey's Line via social media. Speaking of Suicide is an Adventurous Audio Limited production, and the music is Nana by Tom Ireland.